By 3 o'clock, her arms ached with the old honesty of scrubbing. Lye bit the thin skin at the base of her fingers. The sting steadied her. She ate a biscuit that tasted like stone but sat like courage. Then she walked toward the freight office. Under a sky that had finally decided to show its storm. Clouds gathered in the west, gray bellies torn like old shirts. Wind stroked down the main street and lifted, dust as if brushing a horse's coat. Elias's office was exactly where he'd said, a door with flaking paint, a window with a star of cracked glass, and inside a desk whose surface was a map of a life's labor, nicks, scorches, ink stains, and a section worn smooth by the heel of a hand that had learned to reconcile numbers no one else wanted to look in the eye. He looked up when she entered, eyes brighter in the sudden dim. "You came. I said I would." She stood, uncertain whether to sit before being invited, and then sat because the chair looked like it needed the company. He handed her a stack of invoices, scribbled on with 3 different hands and a ledger whose spine had been repaired with careful stitches that matched nothing, twine, catgut, a strip of leather cut from a boot top. "What you'll make of that is more than I have time for, and more than my patience deserves." She put her hands on the work. The relief was physical. Numbers had always offered her a kind of pasture where her mind could breathe. She began. "To tally, your driver Tal sent word he delivered to Mason's Gulch, but Mason claims only 4 crates arrived." She glanced up. "How much do you trust Tal?" "As far as I can carry him," Elias said. "Man's honest to a fault, which in this territory is more a diagnosis than a compliment." "Then the error is in Mason," she said. "He owes you for 8. He likes to talk so fast about his own fairness he forgets who's listening." Elias leaned back, a small smile growing where most men had none. "You've been here 6 hours and know Mason's doctrine already. If you can write that letter, cite the bill of lading, and make the words pretty enough that he wants to frame the insult, I'll pay you 30 cents for the afternoon. 40 if you can read what my cousin meant by this." He slid a scrap across numbers. And fractions scrawled like a storm's handwriting. She read it, turned it around, read it upside down, and saw the sense of it click into place like the teeth of a key. He meant to split the load 3 ways and forgot he'd promised 2/3. To the widow up at Thunder Creek to settle the debt on her wagon. She wrote quickly. "If you pay the widow sooner, she won't have to sell her stove. It's cast iron. It's a good one. That stove will keep 3 children warm next winter as well as feed them if you make sure she has wood." Elias watched her as if he were watching rain finally happen where it had been needed long. "You see the shape of more than numbers." "I see the shape of what numbers sit on," she said. "Always have." Thunder grumbled. She wrote, calculated, mended. The ledger with thread she asked for, Elias produced it from a drawer with a shrug. As if every drawer should contain whatever a person needed, and when she pricked her finger, the bead of blood bloomed bright. She pressed it to her mouth and tasted copper and the stern taste of lye, and thought, "I am here. Not as a parcel. Not as a rumor or a refusal. Here. By the time the sky broke, just a clean cut down the belly of the West Marin had earned 45 cents. Elias had added the extra nickel without commentary. "For the stove," he said. "It will not be enough," she said. "But it will be something." "It will be the beginning of something," he said. And the way he said beginning made the word hunker down and start building. She left his office in the rain, coat over her head, laughing before she realized. The sound belonged to her. Water came sweet as if God had kept the good kind for this minute. Dust turned to the smell of life. Children ran with buckets. Women tilted basins. Men looked up and calculated what this might mean for cattle and conscience. She did not see Silas Bragg until he was 3 steps away, hat slick, eyes bright as knives washed clean. He had no Mrs. Plum with him now. He had a man, square-shouldered, coat too heavy for the weather, a bulge under the lapel that did not belong to Bones. Miss Ashdown. Silas's voice had been polished by the rain. "A word." She drew her coat closer. "I am wet and tired. If you plan to say I told you. So you'll need to shout. The rain has its own opinions." "Not at all." He held out a folded document. She recognized the agency's hand, a small matter of contract. "Mrs. Plum could not have anticipated your refusal. There's always the question of fees. In such circumstances, one expects a gentleman to absorb the loss. And I am a gentleman. Still, it would ease the record if you agreed you had misrepresented certain things." "No." The word surprised both of them. It arrived so round and complete, she might have set it on a table and served tea on it. "I won't sign your lie to make your ledger feel better about itself." The square-shouldered man shifted so the bulge under his coat pressed pain into his posture. He had the expression of a person who has given himself permission. Silas's smile thinned. "You are new here. You don't know how ink can unmake a person. It is a delicate thing, a reputation. Perhaps you believe that because you sold your hours to a blacksmith, you have acquired an ally. But Mr. Corbin is a tradesman with a wounded hip and debts. He will be generous until someone puts a price on his conscience. Everyone has one. Miss Ashdown, a price." She felt heat rise again, not shame this time but a clean burn. "Not everyone." Lightning sawed the sky. The mule down at Mrs. Albright's loosed an opinionated bray that sounded like a curse and a hymn at once. Marin swallowed the taste of fear, which arrived like a reflex from other days and other rooms, where men with gold in their voices had tried to make her small. "If you'll excuse me, I have biscuits to turn to supper." The square-shouldered man stepped into her path. "Best sign the paper," he said. His voice was flour-dry and gravel-hard, as if it had been baked too long in another man's oven. "Best for everyone." Elias emerged from the freight office door behind her, easy, unhurried, as if the rain answered to him. He took in the arrangement of people with one long glance. Marin's chin, Silas's paper, the weapon-shaped bulge. He did not move fast. He moved right. "Problem?" Silas rolled the paper in his fingers, as if it were a fuse he could snuff any time he liked. "Only civility between neighbors. I was explaining to Miss Ashdown how the agency will require. The agency can write me direct," Marin said. "They have already received my letter." She touched the pocket where the copy lived. She had written it in Boggs's neat office with ink that dried slow and true. Silas's gaze darted, quick as a lizard. "You wrote what? What was mine to say?" She met his eyes and managed to keep her voice from trembling. "That you expected a woman who could be proof of your prosperity and pay the fee for being seen with you. That I brought instead a pair of hands that refuse to be told what they are worth by anyone's cane." His smile vanished. The man beside him shifted again, and the coat's bulge lifted and settled like a threat remembering its lines. Elias's presence at her shoulder felt like the opposite of a hand on a leash. It felt like a door with the lock on her side. "I won't sign," Marin said. "And I won't be made to pay for a train I didn't ask to return me anywhere." Silas considered the rain, as if it had given the wrong answer and would soon be replaced. "Very well. The territory has ways to encourage cooperation, Mr. Pike." He did not have to tell the square-shouldered man to show the badge. The man lifted the lapel himself with the theatrical air of someone who believes costumes confer morality. The star that gleamed there was real enough. The man's eyes were not. "Deputy," Elias said neutrally. "Obstruction of a lawful officer is a jailable offense," Pike intoned. "This woman contracted herself under false pretenses and now refuses the correct remedy." "What remedy is that?" Elias asked. "To return what does not rightly belong to her, passage costs and the use of a good man's time." "She is a person," Elias said, "not freight." Dawn flared pale along the rim of Ashford Crossing, turning the telegraph wires into thin strings of light and the wagon ruts into silver scars. Tamsin Crowell stood on the threshold of Harlan Voss's freighting yard with her hands tucked into the sleeves of a borrowed work shirt and the taste of last night's humiliation still coppery on her tongue. The depot platform had been a stage, the townspeople an audience, and Barlow Finch's slick hair, polished boots, and a mother with a jaw like a clamp their ringmaster. Too poor, he'd said without lowering his voice, as if poverty were a disease you could spread by breathing. The word had landed like a slap and then kept ringing, clang after clang. Every time she'd blinked, the freight yard woke the way big beasts do shudder first, then breath, then muscle. Chain clinked in the half-light. Someone laughed and coughed at once. A mule stamped and shook its harness, bells jingling damply. Harlan's men rolled tarps off wagon beds and fumbled with coffee that looked more like creek water than something meant for drinking. None of them pressed too close to her. Men rarely knew where to put their eyes when a woman's future had been publicly returned to sender. Ledger's in the office, Harlan said, nodding toward a shack with a stovepipe. That had seen better days. He was all steady angles this morning, jawline unshaven, coat thrown on over a flannel shirt, hat set low. His voice carried the rasp of someone who slept light and woke heavy. I won't have you lift in loads until your hands know our weights and roots. You said you can keep figures, let's prove it. She held his gaze for a breath. No pity. There. Thank God. Only the same tempered attention he'd given her last night when he'd offered shelter without asking her to pay for it with something other than work. Yes, Mr. Voss. Harlan, he corrected. Then, after a beat, coffee's bad, but it's warm. It will do. The office stove took coaxing. Tamsin stacked slivers of kindling like a tiny fence and blew until the flame gripped, her lungs burning with it. When the stovepipe hiccuped and smoke rolled back, she turned her face and laughed quietly into her shoulder, because even a treacherous stove could be kinder than the people who'd watched her be weighed and measured and found wanting. The ledger. Weighted warped leather, grubby ribbon, corners thumbed thin by rain and men who never washed well enough to suit a book. Tiny pricks of comfort lit in her chest at the sight of neat columns and the promise of order. Numbers did not lie in numbers. Did not blush. Numbers at least let you climb them, rung by rung. She unrolled her sleeves, dipped a pen nib, and let the day settle around her in scratchings and sums. The loads already listed told a short, worried story. 4 wagons of milling timber past due to the railroad work camp at Red Mesa. 2 wagons of lamp oil overdue at the station north of the river. A week's worth of oats gone to mules and nothing yet paid against the debt at Harrow and Pike's Bank. Harrow. The name thudded. She'd only heard it last night, hissed by a woman whose pearls were clamped tight in her throat. Harrow and Pike owned the bank, half the town's facades, and most of its smugness. Harlan ducked into the office with a rolled map and a handspan of dawn in his beard. He smelled like damp canvas and winter apples. We're light on time and lighter on coin. Railroad pays on delivery, not promise. Timber's stacked, but Talbot's foreman short weighs us every time. Talbot? She didn't look up from the column of figures. Rex Talbot, the foreman at Red Mesa? Harlan's head tilted as if he had not expected her to know the name. You've been here a night. I listened, she said simply, and made herself smile so he could see she meant no offense. People speak louder when they're certain. The poor are deaf. Rex and I have history, he said, as if that were enough. As if history was a neutral object you could set aside on a shelf while you did honest business. Tamsin drew a line through a muddled list, where someone had recorded weights and then erased them with the heel of a dirty hand or maybe the truth. Your scale, she asked. Who calibrates it? His mouth pulled to one side. Me. Every Sunday I put iron on it I know to be true, and every Monday Rex puts his boot on yours. She finished softly, not accusing, not yet. She pushed the ledger across the scarred desktop and tapped the numbers. He'd written in a clean hand long before fatigue had smudged the others. If we trust these, then we are losing 20, maybe 30 pounds off every short plank load he accepts. Multiply that by a week and you've financed his poker habit. Harlan's gaze traveled to the window where morning pulled itself upright along the yard fence. The muscle in his jaw ticked. Men swear I dream enemies where there are only neighbors. Enemies don't need to be imagined if they're writing themselves into your accounts. She lifted the pen again. Let me take the loads today. Or at least the ledger. Her pulse jumped at her own audacity. She was not from here. She was no man's wife. But humiliation had a way of scalding away caution, and the world cracked wide when you were told you had no worth. What was there left to lose? He studied her the way a carpenter studies a knot. Is it weakness or a different kind of strength? You know wood? Enough to keep it from burning down a town, she said, and caught the flicker of a grin in his eyes. By noon, she knew the names of the men who carried the yard's work. Moss, who had hands like roots and a voice that made even mules listen. Little Dell, who was not little and laughed with his whole belly. Ortega, who whistled every song out of key but made the air in front of him cheerful anyway. They watched her quietly at first, then less so when she shouldered past their doubt with measures and chalk and that way of moving her body as if it, too, were a tool you sharpened. At the scale she knelt and brushed away the grit where the beam met the fulcrum. Someone had pressed a sliver of metal beneath it, hammered thin enough to hide as dirt, thick enough to rob them blind. Rage came on her like fever, fast, blurring the edges of everything. Barlow Finch's voice mincing down. The depot steps, too poor. As if poverty made you stupid. As if it made you quiet. She lifted the sliver with the point of a nail and held it up. Sunlight made a coin of it. Will you look at that? Little Dell breathed. Seems honest. Weight is a slippery creature. Harlan said nothing. He did not have to. His breath changed, a short in and out sound that had no place for words. He took the sliver and turned it in his fingers. It wasn't forge work. It was kitchen knife labor. The kind of thing a man does when he's trying to remember whether he's cruel or only careless. The next load, Tamsin said. We weigh twice. Here, and then there with Rex counting. And we carry this. She slid the ledger into her satchel and cinched it tight. You're planning to walk a book into a camp full of men who settle disputes with fists. Harlan's voice was mild, but the caution in it pricked her in a tender place because it felt like care, and she was not used to receiving it without a price. I'm planning to measure, she said. If any man is certain of the truth, let him not fear to watch it be written. They rolled at 1 o'clock, the sun a stubborn coin stuck high in a thin winter sky. Tamsin perched on the wagon bench beside Moss. Harlan took the front team. His shoulders set. The road to Red Mesa climbed out of town and then shouldered along a ridge, all scrub and shale and wind that carried distant hammering from the railroad cuts. Telegraph wire went with them, a taut line running ahead like a thought that wouldn't let go. What were you before you were a bride? Moss asked as the wheels ground and the mules fell into that plodding rhythm that said a day would be spent before you noticed it. Tamsin rolled the edge of her sleeve between her fingers. Hungry, she said, and then smiled because she heard what that sounded like. A ledger clerk for a foundry. When the foundry closed, a laundry girl. When the laundry's boiler cracked, a woman writing letters so careful the man on the other end might think he could hold them. Finch? Moss spat over the side of the wagon. She could say it now without having the syllables stick. Finch. She did not add that what Finch had liked best in her letters were the parts where she drew a small life and left blank the parts that showed how sharp her mind could be. Men like Finch did not admire a woman's thought unless it was appraised and sold with the dowry. I printed my words neat. I told him I could cook without wasting salt. He said he wanted modesty. A laugh caught in her throat and came out sounding like a cough. But what he meant was price. Red Mesa spread along the shoulder of its namesake like a bad idea that had gotten traction. Tents and shacks, a handful of clapboard buildings, and then the skeleton of a water tower against the sun. Men moved, everywhere carrying, shouting, swinging picks. A row of pines had been felled and lay like a row of giants sleeping off a fight. The air smelled like pitch and sweat and iron. Rex stood near the supply shed with his thumbs hooked in his belt as if he'd invented the idea of hips. He had a foreman's mustache and a foreman's laugh, and the kind of hat men wear when they're convinced the world will not rain on them without asking permission first. "Was," he said, and the syllable found a way to be both greeting and insult. "You brought extra weight?" His eyes cut to Tamsin as if her being a woman made the world off balance. "Ledger," Harlan said. "Pretty little book," Rex drawled. "You going to write me a poem?" Tamsin climbed down before Moss could offer a hand. "Numbers," she said, "because sometimes you had to meet a sneer with the most ordinary truth you owned." "We weighed this load at the yard. We'll weigh it here. Then I will write what both scales say." She set the ledger on a crate and uncorked her pen. "If they agree, we leave friends. And if they don't?" He laughed the way men laugh when they've already decided the ending. "Then we fix whichever is wrong." Two of Rex's men shouldered past her to the scale, bumping not hard enough to bruise, but hard enough to say they could. Tamsin steadied herself with a palm on the rough wood and made herself breathe as if the sky were not so high and she were not so small. Harlan's presence reached her like heat without touching. She could feel where he was, a part of her mind setting his position, and his breath the way a fiddler sets pitch. Rex watched the beam settle and then called a number. That was a joke if a joke could take food from mules. "Write it, sweetheart." Tamsin looked at the beam and then at the sliver of shadow beneath the notch that should have sat flush. She smiled without showing teeth. "Your fulcrum's dirty." "The hell it is." She pulled a handkerchief from her satchel, knelt, and wiped slowly, deliberately. The grease mark that surfaced was not from work. It was from a hand that had pressed the beam down and then reached for coin. She stood and offered Rex the cloth as if he might want to keep the evidence. "Try again." He did. The beam climbed, then settled at a number that did not match his mouth. Men around them made the small sound people make when they are watching a card trick undone. Rex's smile did not reach his eyes. "Write your poetry," she wrote. Then she wrote the number from the yard. Then she added the two numbers and divided them, the pen nib whispering like a secret. "We will invoice by the average," she said, her voice steady though her knees felt treacherous. "And we will repeat this dance with every wagon until your men remember how to brush a scale." Harlan's laughter was a single breath out through his nose, but she felt the weight in it, approval set down carefully so it wouldn't break the box he kept it in. Rex's jaw tightened, but he waved the men forward, and the day uncoiled into work the way a rope uncoils into its purpose. By the time the sun slid toward evening and made the mesa blush like a man embarrassed by his own temper, they had weighed 4 loads and recorded 4 averages and seen the truth settle in everyone's bones. No one named the theft. Naming a thing made it animate, made it look back at you. But Harlan's men walked taller, and Rex stopped smiling, and Tamsin's ledger pages lay thick with a kind of power she had almost forgotten she could hold. They rattled home with the sky going lavender at the edges and snow and the smell of it. The mules eager, because animals always know when a day has decided to be done. Moss began another off-key whistle, and then stopped himself with a shrug that made Tamsin love him a little for trying. In the yard, the men stepped down lighter. Someone slapped the side of a wagon as if it had done more than carry timber and wages. It had also carried back a piece of their dignity. Harlan followed her into the office and shut the door against the sudden watchful quiet. "That was a choice," he said. "I like choices," Tamsin answered without looking up. Her fingers were ink-streaked, and the skin at the crook of her thumb had the delicate cut a pen sometimes leaves. "If you hold it too long, the world offers women too," bend or break. I don't bend, elegant, and I'm not keen on splinters. His laugh came from low in his chest, a sound like a plank settling square against another. There's the bank, he said after a moment. Harrow will smell money the way a coyote smells stringy meat. He's got a balloon clause in our loan you could hang a man with. Balloon clause? The foundry had been a place of noise, and heat and debt, and the debt had sat in ledgers like a vulture in a tree. Interest steps up if we miss even one delivery day. Fine print buried under smaller print. Then we won't miss, she said. And only when his eyes flicked up did she realize she'd sounded like a woman making a vow to herself and not to him. The vow met its first test on Sunday, when Mrs. Aurelia Pike, Harrow's partner in matrimony and taste, organized a charity dinner in the church hall and announced subtly enough to be cruel that donations would be taken for town improvements and for those among us in need. The ellipsis was a slow turning of her head toward Tamsin. Tamsin wore the dress she'd mended in Harlan's kitchen, a midnight navy calico with a collar she'd stitched twice to get it sharp. She braided her hair and pinned it, and when the pins bit her scalp, she told herself pain meant it would hold. Harlan stood beside her in the doorway as ash-gray daylight slanted across the pews and made the brass lamp fittings glow like promises. People rarely kept. We don't have to go, he said. She steadied the ribbon at her throat. We do. It was a small town's feast, the kind of table that announces a place is proud and worried in equal measure. Goose roasted too long until the fat turned to varnish. Potatoes mashed so hard a spoon stood in them like a flag. Pies that could make a woman cry because flour and sugar had been fought for in someone's kitchen and turned into something that said a day could be sweet if you had the hands to shape it. Aurelia moved among the tables with a basket for coins, her smile a narrow slice of perfected politeness. When she reached Tamsin, Aurelia lifted the basket higher as if it were a mirror in which she could check the set of her pearls. We are so blessed you've landed on your feet, she said. Some women would have fallen. Tamsin could feel Harlan beside her, a contained storm. She placed her palm flat on the table to keep it from clenching. I've always found my feet, she said softly. It's my hands people try to take away. Then contribute with your hands, Aurelia said brightly. A stitchery circle for the less fortunate? Gloves for those who cannot afford proper ones? She cocked her head, the pearls clicking faintly against one another like teeth. Or perhaps you'll put a coin in. I already have, Tamsin replied and lifted the ledger from her satchel. A few heads turned. More would follow. We corrected the scale at Red Mesa. That's coin back in Ashford. Crossing wages that stay in men's pockets instead of wandering off into someone else's. She smiled not sweetly. My coin is arithmetic. Shall I put it in your basket? Laughter pinpricked the air. Not cruel, not all of it. The kind of laughter people let go of when they have been held too tight for too long. Aurelia's color rose and then sank again, and she moved on. Harlan's hand brushed Tamsin's sleeve. The way a man might test a plank he's proud to stand on. They were almost to the pie when Lyle Harrow himself came and sat without being asked. He had a banker's softness about the mouth, a man used to folding and unfolding other people's fear until it lay flat and left an impression the shape of his fingers. Miss Crowell, he said, as if the syllables were porcelain. Mr. Voss, I've seen your accounts. Have you? Tamsin kept her face open, because a woman who looks closed is called sullen in this town, and a woman who looks open is called available, and she aimed for some third thing that had room in it for self-respect. We were planning to speak with you Monday regarding the stepped interest. Harrow's eyes flickered. He had not expected a woman to know the phrase. Then we will speak. Meanwhile, a word of caution. A woman who raises her voice in a town like ours may discover there are few men who will hire her once the novelty wears off. A man who shortens one column and fattens another will discover his ledger cannot be trusted to hold when he adds himself to it, Tamsin said. She smiled as if they'd discussed weather. Thank you for the caution. He inclined his head and left. Harlan let out a slow breath. You throw words like a smith throws sparks. I know where they'll land, she whispered back, and wasn't entirely lying. The truth was that some of her words flew larger than she had intended, and watching them burn in other people's faces left her exhilarated and exhausted by turns. Monday arrived with low skies and a thin rain that made the dirt street into a ribbon of gruel. Tamsin wiped her boots at the bank door and stepped into a room designed to make a person small. The counter was too high, the ceilings too low, and the safe sat in one corner like a cowed animal guarding a secret it was ashamed of. Harrow waited. Behind a desk so polished it held a warped reflection of whoever stood before it, as if to remind supplicants that honesty could be bent. Mr. Voss's loan steps from 5 to 8% this month, Harrow said, sliding a paper across the glass and tapping the clause enshrined there like a small bad law. Your delivery delays created this reality. Talbot's scale created it, Tamsin said, and laid her ledger flat on top of his document, as if it were a hand on a beating heart. Here is the proof of the correction. And here, she set down a second sheet, is the letter of complaint to the Territorial Rail Office regarding underweighing and the collusion between a foreman and a banker who profits from stepped interest when a local freighter's deliveries fall short. She met his eyes, keeping her own steady with effort. It is not signed yet. There was a pleasurable kind of silence then, the sort that meant the world had tilted a degree, and no one knew whether to call it a mistake or a miracle. Harrow's fingers smoothed the edge of the paper until the fibers rasped. You're bluffing. I've no time for cards, Tamsin said. We have timber to move. Reduce the step to 6% this month in acknowledgement of the foreman's malfeasance, and we will pay it off in full upon the railroad's remittance. Or we can ask a man in a better hat than yours to name what has been happening in Red Mesa. Harrow looked at Harlan, then at Tamsin, and finally at the ledger as if it might get up and walk out on its own. 6, he said, each letter bitten. Off like something sour. But if you miss, we won't, she said. They didn't. Not that week. Not the next. Her days arranged themselves around the ledger and the creak of wagon wheels, and the peculiar joy of making men who were used to talking listen instead. Harlan's kitchen learned her footsteps. His dog learned her whistle. The yard learned her handwriting. She was not a bride and not a charity case and not a scandal no matter how often Aurelia's circle used the word in doorways. She was a woman who made a column add up and a day stand straight, and a man like Harlan rest his hand on the edge of his desk as if he'd found a surface that didn't wobble under him. The town could almost have forgiven her for all of that if she'd stayed small. But a woman who has been told she is poor learns to hoard the one currency no one can take: competence. And competence grows when it's fed. It happened on a Tuesday, the light thin as tea. Tamsin stayed late to close the week's accounts because the railroad had demanded politely, the way men in suits demand, that Harlan prove every pound twice. She had spread the ledger and the receipts and the scale calibrations across the office table, so it looked like she was charting a sea in Ashford. Crossing was a stubborn rock in it. Harlan had walked her to the door and then gone back to the yard to check the tarps. Storm coming, he'd said, tilting his face to a wind that tasted like distance. I can smell Nevada in it. She smiled at that and bent again to the numbers, losing track of time because numbers did that to her. They pulled you into their river. And once you let go, the shore got very far away. A sound reached her that had no place in the yard at night, the thin, greedy glug of liquid poured where nothing clean should be poured. Kerosene. The recognition slid along her spine like a blade put down gently. She stood very still and listened hard the way fear makes. You. It came again, to the south of the office, then farther off to the west wall of the warehouse where they kept canvas and spare harness and the kind of things a fire loves. She moved without thinking, the way you do when thought is a luxury you pay for by dying. Ledger into satchel. Satchel strap across her chest. She snuffed the lamp with a pinch and slid her palm along the wall to the door. The air already held the edge of smoke, that sour, fast-moving smell that turns decent people into fools with buckets. Through the office window, she saw a shadow detach from the dark and become a man at the corner of the warehouse. He straightened and looked over his shoulder. The moon came out from behind a cloud as if it had been waiting to deliver a verdict. Barlow Finch's profile cut clean against the pale sky, chin proud, mouth small. He lifted his hand and struck a match. Tamsin's heart stuttered and then steadied in a way that made no sense. She reached for the door and the handle wouldn't turn. Barred. The bar she and Harlan set every night because safety had a habit of making prisons of good habits if someone clever turned them inside out. The match flared and kissed something he'd already soaked. Flame crawled like a red fox's tail along the warehouse boards, and then leaped as if suddenly recognizing itself. Finch melted back into the dark with the careful speed of a man who does not want to be seen running. Tamsin. Spun toward the small back window. Too narrow for a man with shoulders. Maybe just wide enough for a woman who had taught her body to be small and her courage to be large. She shoved the table under the window, climbed, and planted her palms to lever herself through. The sash stuck. She set her teeth and shoved harder. Wood moaned. Outside, somewhere, someone shouted Harlan maybe. Or Moss. The fire answered by finding the stacked canvas and making joy out of it. Heat rolled at her back. A breath from a throat that did not wish her well. She angled her shoulders, exhaled. Everything she had as if poverty had taught her to spend air carefully, and slid until the sill bit her hips. A beam somewhere in the warehouse cracked like a judge's gavel. Behind her, glass shattered. The sound belonged to two men in the yard who had never broken anything in anger and were now breaking everything in the name of saving it. Tamsin. Harlan's voice hoarse, too close, then moving away as if he meant to circle the building, because a man with broad shoulders will try to make the world break where it allows him to push. She hooked her elbow around the sill, gritted her teeth, and pulled. The sash gave a handspan, then another. Smoke curled up and slid over her mouth with the intimacy of gossip. She coughed and choked and tasted ash, and in that bitter taste there was a silver of memory she did not have time to examine, the weight of a foundry ledger. The way a foreman had said her numbers were too tidy for a girl. The first time she'd understood that competence could attract cruelty. A hand seized her forearm. Moss. Got you. He grunted. By God, girl, don't breathe. She didn't. He hauled and she wriggled, and then she was spilled onto cold dirt where breath hurt like someone had priced it too high. The world tilted at a strange angle while her lungs decided whether this was a future worth continuing. When the air went in again, it came with the sound of fire in it, which is wind and roaring, and the pop of things that once held together deciding they won't anymore. Harlan knelt, so close his knees bumped hers. He put his hands on either side of her face, clumsy, as if he'd meant to be gentle and forgot how because panic had a foot on his chest. Any breaks? Only in my patience. She coughed smoke and tried to laugh, which turned into more coughing and then a weird, bubbling kind of hysteria that stopped only when his thumb brushed the soot at her temple as if he were wiping chalk from a slate. Water! Someone shouted. Buckets ran person to person in a human chain that glowed orange every time the flames leaned toward them. The warehouse roof began its slow, horrible conversation with gravity. Who? Harlan asked, and the word was a hammer. She swallowed. Finch. She could see his disbelief rise and then smolder out. I saw. Moss swore like a prayer. I'll fetch the sheriff. No time, Harlan said, eyes on the fire. We put this down or the whole yard goes, then the town dell. Take the team and pull the west wagon away. The fire took a breath and then another, and the breaths came faster as if the blaze, too, had learned to count and liked it. A small barrel on the porch of the warehouse popped its lid with a hopeful puff, and then went off like a cannon. Lamp oil they'd been meaning to move. The world lifted and dropped. Tamsin felt the concussion in her teeth. She rolled and covered her head with her arms and let a cry out that had no words. When she blinked, she saw stars where there should be smoke, as if the sky had come down to witness their foolishness and then decided to stay a while. Harlan's hand closed around her wrist. Stay with me. He pulled her to her knees. We'll lose the building. We'll save the yard. Hear me? She nodded. The ledger pressed against her ribs through the satchel. She put her hand there as if to steady a child she was carrying. The books, she said, not sure if anyone could hear. Her. I have them. Good. He looked at her, really looked, even with the fire chewing at the edge of his vision, and something passed between them like a promise out loud. People might overhear if they weren't careful. I don't care about the rest. You will. In the morning, she managed. Then I'll start small. He put the flat of his hand against her back to steady her while they both stood, and the heat shoved at them like a bully who didn't know how to be anything else. First, we save you. Shouts rose at the edge of the yard. Not panicked, not helpful. The kind of shouts men make when they smell a spectacle and don't yet know whether they'll be asked to pay for it. Tamsin turned her head and saw figures. At the fence line 4, 5, 6 men. One stepped forward enough for the firelight to catch his boots and the cut of his coat. Barlow Finch. He had his mother's jaw and none of her discipline. His hat brim made a dark right angle against the glow. Voss, he called, pitching his voice so it rolled easy over flame and fear. Shame about your storehouse. Ought to ensure better. Harlan started toward him as if the fire had taught him how to move faster. Moss grabbed his sleeve, held him a heartbeat, then let go when he understood that something other than rage was marching Harlan forward. A decision you could call a man by. Don't, Tamsin said, and didn't recognize her own voice. Finch's smile widened, then flattened. He cocked an ear toward the street as if hearing the second act arrive. Hoofbeats, not the clatter of passing ranch hands. The measured, purposeful drumming of men who rode in formation because they preferred the world that way order on their side. Chaos everywhere else. The sheriff, Tamsin thought with a short flare of relief so bright it burned. But the shape that slipped under the telegraph wire was not the sheriff's 2-star hat. It was Harrow, with 2 deputies behind him and a half-dozen men who wore the faces of bank clerks reimagined as pauses stiff, pleased blank. Harrow swung down from his horse with the grace of someone who did not do it often. Evening, he said, as if they were all gathered for a social and someone had unfortunately set the decorations on fire. His gaze traveled to the flames and then returned to Harlan. You keep unfortunate hours for accounting, Voss. I wonder. At your desk, Harlan snapped. We're busy. Harrow's smile did not bend. Busy indeed. Busy catching fire. Busy defaulting. I have here, he tapped his breast pocket, a notice of seizure if you should fail to meet obligations by dawn. By dawn? Tamsin heard her own voice from far away, steady and sharp. The clause says close of business. In the event of conflagrations, Harrow said, and now his smile did bend. The bank reserves the right to interpret hours so as to secure collateral. He lifted a hand and his men fanned toward the yard gate, as if the air itself had agreed to open for them. We'll take what remains. You may apply for mercy in the morning. The ledger thudded against her ribs like a frightened bird. Tamsin stepped between Harrow and the gate before she could ask herself if she had the right. Smoke clawed down her throat. Her eyes stung until the world blurred. Harrow's outline wavered and then steadied. You'll not take a thing, she said, until I'm done counting what belongs to us. Miss Crowell, Harrow breathed, weary and delighted at once. Do get out of the way. That's the problem, she whispered. Women like me stay out of the way so men like you don't have to step around what's right. She turned and put her back to him, facing the fire that was chewing the warehouse the way a story chews a liar. Harlan came to her side, shoulder to shoulder, and together they made a small, insufficient wall. Damn it, Moss yelled from somewhere to their left. Roof's going. The timbers above the warehouse door shifted with a sound like a barn groaning in its sleep. Flame ran the length of the ridgepole and then folded inward the way a woman folds cloth and makes something terrible into something tidy. Move. Harlan's hand closed around Tamsin's elbow, hard enough to bruise, kind enough to save. They lunged backward as the roof gave up its argument with gravity. And above the roar of collapse, just as the world tilted and came down, and the night tried to decide how much of itself it meant to keep, Barlow Finch lifted a hand and snapped his fingers. The men at the fence reached to their coats. Metal flashed. The yard filled with the sound of hammers drawn back. Tamsin's breath stopped in her chest. Because she knew what a fire could take. And she knew what men with paper and pistols could. And just before the heavy roof timbers finished their fall, just before Flame and Ash and Harrow's notice of seizure all met in the narrow strip of ground where she and Harlan stood, Tamsin understood that this night would decide who she got to be in Ashford Crossing, and whether Too Poor would go on meaning without a voice, or become the name of the story she would never again allow someone else to tell. The timbers dropped, pistols rose. Harrow smiled, and someone behind the fire shouted Tamsin's name with such fierce relief it sounded like a rescue already happening, just as the roof let go. Just as the roof let go. It fell like a verdict, all at once, and then in slabs, the ridgepole folding with a groan that seemed older than the yard itself. Heat punched outward. Sparks rose in a wild, bright swarm. Tamsin didn't think. Her body new to danger, old to deprivation, chose. She turned her face, threw her arm over her eyes, and felt Harlan's palm find the back of her shoulder, a flat, steadying press that said one thing in the language the body knows. Here, the guns did not fire. Their owners flinched when the roof thundered down, the first volley of pistols stolen by the reflex that keeps even cruel men from shooting at the sky. Tamsin. The shout came through the veil of heat and ash with such clean relief it cut her name down to its bone. It wasn't Harlan he was breathing beside her, teeth clenched. It wasn't Moss, his oath was a constant growl to her left as he dragged a barrel away from the licking edge. This voice carried iron and command and a foreman's impatience with hesitation. Crowell down, she dropped. A second later, a spear of water tore across the yard, white and impossible against the orange, slapping the new-sprung flames flat. The arc swung, found the heart of the blaze, and roared. A hose, thick as a man's wrist, whipped like a live thing in the hands of three men braced wide. A locomotive stood at the far fence as if it had snuck up. During the collapse, a switching engine, low and ugly, the kind that does heavy work without asking admiration for it. Its tender brimmed with water, and two pump carts had been dragged close, leather seals squealing as men worked pistons with their whole bodies. Behind the spume of steam stood Rex Talbot, hat shoved back, shirt dark with sweat. On the ridge, he bellowed, and the stream climbed obediently. Don't chase the glow hit where it breathes. Tamsin coughed hard enough to see stars again, which made two kinds of stars in one night. Harlan's hand left her shoulder long enough to swipe once at his eyes, then returned. The men at the fence, Finch among them, stumbled back out of the spray's reach, coats spattered and dignity damped. You bring a train into my yard. Harrow managed, incredulous and offended at once. I brought water, Rex said without looking at him. You brought paper. Let's see which burns slower. The hose swung again with a hiss and a low roar. Lightning of a different sort. Steam rolled. The front half of the warehouse sagged to its knees like an exhausted ox, and then lay. Sparks leaped into the dark, met water, and died with the self-pitying sound of candles denied their moment. Gun hammers clicked back again in the shadows beyond the fence. A dry, metallic sound like an insect a man could hate. Finch lifted his chin. His hat brim cut across the glow, a black rule. He could have been any small tyrant at any edge of any town. Tamsin felt her fear, and then felt past it. "Barlow," she called, voice raw but clear. "You set your match wrong. The wind is mine tonight." Heads turned, because accusation has gravity and draws sight the way a falling thing draws breath. Finch didn't move. Harrow did a fraction. A flicker of attention shared between two accounts he suddenly wished were not in the same ledger. Rex glanced once, then back to the flame. "Save names for the sheriff," he said, not unkind, and jerked his chin toward the sagging blazing frame. Vossier West walls about to fall wrong. Harlan was already moving, a broad-shouldered blur in a world of sharp light. Dell, Ortega, lines on that corner now. They went like men in a drill they'd never practiced but knew they would one day need. Ropes bit palms, boards cracked. The hose chewed a notch out of a wall, just enough to convince it to fall to the side that wouldn't eat the harness shed. It toppled, grumbling, and died in a spray and a gout of steam and the small private groans that buildings make when they're learning what it is to be over. The fire shrank from a roar to a tantrum, then to something like exhaustion. The pumpers slowed, then stopped, chests heaving. The sudden quiet rang. Harrow shook his hat once, prim as a cat, and smoothed his mustache with his thumb. "Are we finished behaving like miners at a flood?" he asked, voice genteel and sticky. "Because I do believe there is a matter before us." He patted his breast pocket. Paper hissed faintly as it settled. "Seizure? Of what?" Rex asked, as if the word were a foreign coin held up to the light. "Wet ashes. Of value," Harrow said. "Of collateral, of the yard." "Collateral doesn't burn," Tamsin said. Her voice surprised her with how level it sounded. "It is men. It is roots. It is customers. It is reputation made right in ledgers. And it is under protection tonight." She tipped her chin toward the locomotive. "Railroad property is intertwined with this yard until my son say it isn't. You interfere. You interfere with a company that puts judges on trains when it must." A murmur went through the knot of men behind Harrow, the mutter a certain class of clerk makes when someone has said the name of a larger clerk. Harrow smiled without his eyes. "You write good theater, Miss Crow. The law will edit." Moss appeared at Tamsin's elbow, as if conjured by her need for a wall. His beard was charred along one edge. The sight of it almost undid her. "Sheriff's out on a stock theft east of town," he said low. "Deputy Pike's been 2 places at once all night." He spat. "Smoke black phlegm. Both of 'em the bank." "Aurelia's brother," Tamsin said, and the line between 2 columns joined itself without effort. Harlan stood a half step ahead of her. "You can try stepping through us," he told Harrow simply, "but you're wearing city shoes." Rex let the hose drop to the dirt, where it lay like a drowned snake. His men sagged into themselves in that honest, spent way that makes uniforms look briefly human, no matter what badge the men wear. He turned at last to face the line at the fence. "Finch," he said mildly, as if the name were a problem on a blackboard, "you smell like kerosene." Barlow made a show of sniffing his sleeve. "You smell like pitch," he drawled. "Occupational." His gaze slid to Tamsin. "You got a gift for blaming your betters for the weather." "My betters would have hands not afraid of ink," she said, and lifted the ledger so the lamplight took the edge of it. "And better weather wouldn't need your match." Harrow sighed, the sound of an indulgent teacher about to scold a class. "Deputies," he said, without looking, "secure the gate." They moved, one on each side of him. Men who, in another story, would have grown tomatoes and grandchildren. In this one, they stood straight and let their shoulders say the words their mouths couldn't afford to. Their hands hovered at their belts. Rex shifted his weight so his left boot planted square. "You plan to use those," he said. "To take what we just saved." "Law is not personal," Harrow said, smoothing his lapel, and the lie was gentle as linen. "Barlow," Tamsin said, and didn't look at Harrow this time, only at the man who had lit the yard because he couldn't bear. "A woman making order where he made mess. I saw you. You lit it. You stood and watched." She thought of the match flaring, his profile cut against the moon, the way he'd stepped back into the dark like a man unaccustomed to the idea the world could witness him. Finch didn't blink. "Prove it." He took a small step forward so. Flame-spattered light fell across his polished boots. There was a new scuff at the right toe, the kind a man gets pushing at a stuck door or kicking a barrel into better position. "Enough." Harrow lifted a palm like a preacher. "Miss Crowell, you will remove yourself. This is between the bank and Mr. Voss." Her mouth went dry in a way that had nothing to do with the fire. "I am Mr. Voss's ledger," she said. "I'll remove when I've been totaled." Somewhere past the yard a bell clanged. The church, once, twice, then fast, then slow. A call and accounting. Windows opened along the street like eyes. The shape of the town emerged: women in shawls, men in shirt sleeves, children with hair wild from sleep, and they came to their fences and clothed their curiosity and concern. Aurelia Pike arrived with her basket, for once without the performance of a smile. Her pearls lay dull at her throat, smoke settling on them like the truth. "My goodness," she breathed, as if wonder had been sharpened to a blade. "What happened?" "Your future brother-in-law tried to foreclose during a fire," Moss sighed cheerfully. He'd found a tin cup somewhere and was drinking water as if it were a sin he intended to continue. Aurelia's eyes slid to Harrow. He did not meet them. There was a little story in that non-meeting. Tamsin filed it away where she kept such things. "Town watches," Rex said, his voice pitched for the new audience. "So let Town watch this. Bank officers trying to seize a SSETS while railroad property is intermingled during a public safety emergency." He folded his arms, looked almost bored. "Be sure to spell the names right when you tell it tomorrow." Harrow understood the math in that. He backed a single step as if the ground beneath his polished shoes had decided to be a docket slack-tied. "We'll proceed under daylight," he said. "Mr. Voss, you will present yourself at my office at 9. Harlan didn't answer. He was looking at Tamsin. She was looking at the warehouse. The hose had left it humped and steaming, black ribs sticking up like a whale on a beach. She pressed her palm to the ledger as if touch could fix value. Her hand came away, smudged with soot. She drew a line across the back of her other hand with that soot, a sudden childish stroke, as if she could mark herself into belonging here. "Crowell," Rex said low, so only she heard. "You could have stood quiet and let me and Voss swing. At this, you didn't." She made herself smile, because the alternative was to sway. "Men forget to wipe scales," she said. "Women remember." He studied her a second longer than necessary, then nodded once. "We'll be back with the dawn," he said aloud. "Water again if you need it, and a crew to haul what can be salvaged." He jerked his chin toward his men. "Leave the small pump." They did. The pump lay on its side like a sleeping animal, its metal belly warm, the smell of wet leather rising from it in brief, comforting breaths. The yard emptied the way a fever breaks, sudden clarity, sweat cooling, the awareness of each ache claiming its place. The townspeople drifted back to their porches, talking low, eyes cutting back to Tamsin as if she were something new on the street that might grow in a direction no one had planted for it. Harlan turned to her only when the last shadow had unstitched from the fence. "Show me your hands," he said. She did. He took them in his and turned them over like a craftsman inspecting a tool he intends to sharpen. The pads of her fingers were reddened, the heel of one palm blistering, the thin skin. At the place where thumb meets forefinger split, he blew gently across the worst of it. The sensation connected to something without a name beneath her ribs. "Pantry," he said. "We've salve that smells like a churchyard. You'll hate it, and it'll help. I should sort the tools," she said, dazed with tired and too aware of where his thumb had left heat on her skin. "And make a list of what we lost." "We'll sort tomorrow," he said, with the flat, particular certainty of a man who has lifted things all his life and knows what weight belongs to which day. "Tonight we count what we kept." He touched her satchel with 2 fingers, reverent. As a man lays a palm on scripture, "You kept it." "The books," she said. "Yes." She did not say, "I kept the person I was when men called me only poor." He found the salve. It smelled like pine and ghosts. He warmed a thumbful against his own palm, then spread it carefully over her blister. She hissed and tried to flinch, and then made herself not, because to hold still under care felt like the most dangerous thing she'd done all day. "You keep fixin' things that aren't yours to fix," he said quietly, eyes on her hand. "Keep hearing they are," she answered. He glanced up then, the look quick and intimate and full of the terror of realizing the ground you stand on is not only solid, it is chosen. He tied a strip of clean cotton around her palm, the knot neat, the ends tucked. "We'll see Harrow at 9. "We'll be there at 8, she said, "because you meet a man who robs you in the same way you meet a dawn, before he's ready." Sleep was a rumor. When it finally came, it smelled like damp wool and burnt pine and whatever Harlan's pillow kept from the world. She woke to gray light and the particular silence that follows a long night, the quiet of a town deciding whether to pretend nothing happened. Ash lay in shallow drifts along the yard, soft as flour. The warehouse had settled into a heap of black bones. The pump's metal was cold. The mule's breath smoked. Moss had set a pot of coffee to boil and was staring at the flames as if considering whether they could be held to account for their cousin the night before. "Town'll say it's God's will," he observed, handing her a tin cup. "God," she said, "doesn't buy kerosene." At 8 they stood on the bank steps as Harrow's clerk adjusted the blinds inside in small, flustered increments. Aurelia arrived with a ledger of her own, a list of women's donations for a relief fund that would make her feel large and Tamsin feel small. She wore black this morning, as if grief were something you slipped into for effect. "Miss Crowell," she said, the syllables turned silk. "You and Mr. Voss are early." "We have work at 9, Tamsin said. "We'd like to keep doing it." Aurelia's eyes dipped to the bandage at Tamsin's hand. Poor thing, the words were perfect. Their aim was not, "I do hope this teaches you something about the dangers of overreaching." The door opened. Harrow stood framed by wood dark as a bruise and glass that frowned. He looked well rested. A man who had dreamt of papers aligning themselves while other people's roofs fell. Inside, the bank smelled like ink and coin and a faint starch Aurelia must have baked into the curtains. Harrow gestured to chairs as if he were doing them a kindness by letting their bodies have rest at the same time their resolve stood. 8%, he said without any preface. "As agreed, as stepped." 6, Tamsin said. "As corrected, as the ledger shows." She placed the book between them. It settled with a small, confident thump. "And the seizure notice was attempted during a public safety emergency." The town watched. "The town forgets," Harrow murmured. "It will remember what I tell it to when interest goes back to 5 next month for those who keep to their payments." He glanced at Harlan's hands deliberately. "Men need credit more than they need to be right." Harlan leaned forward a fraction. "Men need their yards not burned by boys who play at matches and banks who play at law." "Allegations." Harrow breathed the word like cologne. "Bring me the sheriff. Bring me proof." Bring me mathematics that add up to anything in a courtroom. He opened a drawer and slid a single paper instrument across the glass. In the meantime, sign this extension. It will keep me from seizing what remains while we wait on the railroad's remittance. Tamsin did not touch it. What does it cost? A simple fee, Harrow said. 2%. She looked at Harlan. He had the careful stillness of a horse listening beneath a rider he doesn't trust. It costs your neck, she said, and felt the flavor of the words in her mouth iron and something like sweet. We will not sign an extension on a clause. You tried to rush by flinging a lit match at it. She tapped the ledger with a finger she could almost feel again. We'll pay the step 6 when the railroad pays. We'll show this town the numbers. And you can explain to your depositors why you tried to collect ashes. Harrow's smile thinned until it was only attitude and enamel. Miss Crowell, he said softly, you are not a party to this contract. You are, what shall we call you, a clerk, an interloper? His gaze cut sidelong to Harlan, a complication. Call me the math, Tamsin said. Silence gathered, a precise thing, the kind a man can cut his finger on. Harrow's thumb tapped the desk once, twice. He took in a breath so shallow it almost wasn't. Deputy, he said. The inner door opened. Deputy Pike filled it tall, tidy, mustache trimmed, as if spared by a compass. He had Aurelia's nose and Harrow's manner. His badge was polished to the point of mockery. Arrest her, Harrow said, not looking at Tamsin. Obstruction of bank officers and execution of duty. Extortion by means of threatened complaint to a territorial body. Interference with seizure. The world narrowed. Not to the deputy's gun or his handcuffs or even the way his jaw tucked when he was about to do something he'd decided to be proud of. It narrowed to Harlan's breath beside her, a single, contained explosion, and to the weight of the ledger under her palms. You can't, Harlan started, standing so fast his chair scraped. I can, Pike said, and will. He lifted a pair of cuffs and held them as if they were a choice he was allowing her. Miss Crowell. Tamsin stood. Her legs worked like a foal's for a second, then remembered themselves. Let me leave the book, she said to Harlan, and hated that her voice asked and did not command. Under the floorboard. The second plank, he didn't argue. He took the ledger from her, and his hand found hers for the briefest division of a second. Something in his grip said the word she had never let herself require from any man. Stay, she offered her wrists. The cuffs clicked. The sound was small and specific and obscene in the polite room. They walked her out through the bank lobby where Aurelia pretended to find a coin stuck between two tesserae on the floor so she could look without looking. They walked her down the steps where a boy she'd seen stealing apples in summer stood bareheaded in the cold with his hat against his chest because some instinct told him respect and confusion sometimes share a coat. They walked her past Moss, who had drifted like weather to the door and now held his hands in fists because a man keeps them that way when he has promised himself not to use them. Harlan fell in at her shoulder. Pike, he said, you know this is theater. Then, enjoy the show, Pike said, not unkind, which was worse. He put Tamsin into the wagon as if she were a package being returned. Court in 2 hours. Justice of the peace can hear it. He almost smiled. He's punctual. They jolted along the rutted street. The cuffs bit when the wagon hit a rut. She edged them to a less painful place, and then left them there because fussing would mean admitting the bite existed. The jail smelled like old coffee and men who pretend they don't cry. Pike put her in the cell with a small bow. Nothing personal, he said. It never is, she answered, and sat on the narrow bench because the body must be placed somewhere, even when the mind is not. Harlan stood at the bars. There was a dent in the soft place at his chin she hadn't noticed before. It deepened when his jaw set. We'll undo this, he said. You'll keep the book safe, she said. Moss, tell him to fetch the telegraph operator. I want a wire to the railroad claims office by noon. She ran the words like beads touch, count, touch again. And send for Rex. He saw the hose laid from the tender. He'll know what it means for jurisdiction. Harlan's hand came up, palm to palm with hers through the bars. Heat transferred through iron. She pretended not to see that his fingertips shook once, then stilled. You told me last night I'd care about the rest in the morning, he said, and tried for a smile. I do. It's you. It might have been a mercy that Pike returned with ink and a book and the weary efficiency of a man who writes down the names of people who complicated his morning. The moment broke into tasks. They brought her to the hall above the Mercantile for Court Inn. Towns that size, law and flower share rafters. People already filled the benches. Rex stood at the back, arms crossed, eyes unfriendly as offense to certain men, but not to her. Aurelia sat front row with her basket in her lap like a pet she fed from time to time. Harrow took the seat nearest the judge's table and arranged his papers like mirrors. The justice of the peace was a man Tamsin had only ever seen at funerals, a face like hammered copper, a neat beard, eyes that took in everything as if he meant to spend it wisely. He rapped the table once with a wooden mallet that believed in itself more than it should. Lyle Harrow versus Tamsin Crowell with Harlan Voss as interested party, he intoned. Allegations are obstruction, interference, and attempted extortion. Your Honor, Harrow began, smooth as cream poured slow. This woman, Tamsin said, before she could stop herself and felt Harlan's exhale behind her like a wind at her back, has a name. The judge's eyes flicked. Names matter in my hall, he said mildly. Use them. Harrow adjusted a ring that looked like it had a grip on him instead of the other way around. Miss Crowell interfered with lawful seizure, using threats of a spurious complaint to a railroad office to extort favorable terms. She is not a signer on any instrument and thus not a party, and yet she has made herself a nuisance publicly, and to the detriment of good order. Good order, Rex muttered from the back, like firing a yard at night. Mr. Talbot, the judge said without looking up. You'll find order better served by silence until called. Rex lifted both hands, palms out, as if to say he had no quarrel with a gavel he couldn't outrun. Miss Crowell, the judge said, turning to her. On what authority do you speak in bank matters? On arithmetic, she said. On the authority of ledgers I keep true. On behalf of a yard I help run. On behalf of men paid fair because scales on both ends of a road were finely made to match. She wondered whether she should add, and on behalf of a town where another woman's pearls have been more trusted than any column of figures I have ever laid right. But decided truth works best when it doesn't have to bleed. To be seen, Harrow smiled tiny. Poetry again. Your Honor, I move that she be remanded until she learns the difference between a story and a statute. The judge tapped the mallet once. I'll decide who knows lessons in this room. Deputy Pike, why is Mr. Voss's yard smoking? Pike looked uncertain for the first time that day. Fire, Your Honor. Accidental? Unknown. He glanced, involuntary as a cough, toward where Finch leaned against a post with an air of terminal alibi. Mr. Finch, the judge said, surprising everyone including Finch, you witnessed this fire? Finch smiled that small, practiced smile men wear when they've been taught charm is a tribute they can collect from a distance, as concerned citizenry do. Concerned with what? The judge asked. Heat. A few small laughs forgot to stay in throats and fell out. The judge let them lie. He turned back to Harrow. And seizure at night? The clause is clear, Harrow said. Collateral in danger may be secured at any hour. It's common practice in Chicago, Rex said under his breath. The judge's mallet made one hard sound. Enough. He looked at Tamsin again, and for a moment ridiculous, fleeting, she had the impression he saw not her dress or her bandage or the way Her hair had escaped its pins and anxious curls. She felt seen in the way a bridge is seen by a man who must cross it and does not want to fall. "Miss Crowell," he said, "do you have this threatened letter to the railroad?" "In my head," she said, "and in the telegraph office by." Now, if Mr. Voss did as I asked. She didn't look at Harlan because looking would make her want to put her hand on the place above his heart, where she had seen his shirt move when he was frightened for her. Harrow pounced. "You see, Your Honor? She admits to interference by telegraph." "Interference," she said, "is a word banks use when someone checks their math." The judge's mouth twitched in a way a man's does when he has remembered being young. He folded his hands. "We'll take a brief recess while I read this clause you are all so eager to talk to me about, without letting me meet it. Deputy, see if the telegraph office has anything with the railroad's name on it. Mr. Harrow, sit down. Miss Crowell, try breathing." The mallet fell. The room stood. People spill from courtrooms, the way water spills from a broken barrel, curiously. And then all in a rush, the noise rose. The smell of sawdust shifted. Harlan touched the small of Tamsin's back as if to locate her in the rearranging air. "It'll be all right," he said. "You don't know that," she whispered. "I've decided it," he said. He started to say more, but the door at the rear banged open, as if someone had pushed the day itself into the room. The telegraph operator, Dolly Keene, hair in a ragged topknot, boots unlaced, stumbled in with a strip of paper held like a relic. "Judge!" she called, out of breath and full of something that felt like rain after a long dry spell. "Wire from Carson City. Railroad Division offices. Marked urgent." Harrow stood so fast his chair went over. Aurelia's basket slipped and hit the floor with a sound like someone dropping the idea of charity. The judge took the paper. He read again. His eyes climbed to Tamsin's and did not look away. "Miss Crowell," he said, voice suddenly not polite at all, but sharpened and humming the way a saw hums when a man is going to use it to change a room. "Step forward, Mr. Harrow, keep your seat." Tamsin's knees tried to forget how to be knees. She made them remember. The cuff marks at her wrists ached as if taught to do so at the worst possible time. The whole town leaned in as if curiosity were a wind and the judge a match about to be struck. He lifted the telegram. "This," he said, "changes jurisdiction." He looked at Harrow. "And quite possibly your plans." He looked at Tamsin again, and something like a smile, small, proud, private, ghosted across one corner of his mouth. "It appears the railroad has an opinion about whose ledger decides who gets to own this morning." Harrow's hand went to his pocket. The judge's mallet touched the table, a warning without sound. "Read it," someone breathed from the back. "Rex, maybe. Or Moss, or the town itself." The judge opened his mouth, and the church bell began to ring again, hard and wrong, not for worship and not for fire. The door below slammed, chairs scraped. A rumor ran through the floorboards like mice. Deputy Pike burst back in white-faced and winded. "Judge," he gasped. "Jail, keys, someone." He swallowed, and the word scraped. "Someone's taken Mr. Voss's ledger." The room turned as one body to Tamsin. Harrow's eyes flared. Aurelia's hand flew to her pearls. The judge shoved the telegram into his vest, as if the paper itself might need protecting. Tamsin felt the shape of absence, as if a rib had been removed while she was looking right at her own chest. The ledger's weight gone, and with it, every column she had made straight, every defense she had built out of numbers instead of bullets. For a breath, the world showed her the old thing it means when it says poor stripped, voiceless, outmaneuvered by men with paper and a lock. Then breath returned, sharp and cold. "Who?" she said, stepping toward Pike so fast the deputy flinched. "Who took it?" "Didn't see," he stammered. "Cell's clean." Back doors sprung. Operator said a rider went north hard. North, Red Mesa. Rex was already moving, hand on. The post. shouldering past men who'd never been shouldered by a foreman and were now too surprised to be offended. "Tamsin," Harlan said, and the sound of her name in his mouth steadied the floor. "We'll get it." She was already turning, already calculating mules versus horses, telegraph poles versus the reach of a man's wind. She did not ask the judge's leave to leave. Numbers that must be caught don't stop for permission. "Miss Crowell." The judge called above the new noise as she reached the door. "The court will reconvene when the ledger does," she said without breaking stride. She hit the steps running. Harlan and Moss on her heels, the town's murmur swelling behind them like a tide that hadn't decided yet whether to drown or lift. The street flashed by Aurelia's ribbon in the dust, Harrow's clerk's pale face, the pump cart like an abandoned animal, and ahead, at the far end of Maine where the road leans north and the telegraph wire points like a finger at red Mesa, a rider shot out from behind the livery with something square lashed to his saddle. The ledger. Tamsin's breath burned. Her palm throbbed. She did not stop. She would not, because the last thing poverty had taught her was this: there's a ledger you keep inside your chest, and if someone steals the one you wrote with ink, you run after the one written in blood. She put her foot in the stirrup. Moss swung, caught leather, hauled, and the mare under her gathered herself and leaped. The chase began. "Let go." The warehouse roof came down like a verdict, a roar and a rush, and then the slamming hush that follows when wood decides it is finished arguing with gravity. The blast of heat shoved Tamsin and Harlan backward. Sparks leaped and turned to stars mid-air, bright for a heartbeat and gone, as if they had never asked the night for permission to shine. Down. Harlan covered her with his body without thinking, old instincts moving faster than sense. A timber bounced, rolled, and stopped inches from Tamsin's boot. The air tasted like pennies and punishment. She felt the ledger thudding against her ribs, as if the books, too, had a pulse, as if arithmetic had chosen to live. "Hold your line," Moss roared, his voice hauling men back to the bucket chain. "Keep the west wall wet, keep it wet." Over the settling crackle she heard it again. The voice that had cut through fire and distance to find her. Tamsin, not Harlan. Not Moss. The sound carried authority wrapped in relief, the way a rope carries both pull and promise. A rider burst through the orange haze at the far side of the yard, ducked under the drooping telegraph wire, and slid from his saddle while the horse was still moving. He wore a deputy's star that had seen years of weather and a coat scorched at the hem. His hat brimmed threw his eyes into shadow, but the set of his mouth was a man who had decided to believe what he saw, not what he was told. "Sheriff Elias Quinn," Moss said in a grateful exhale, as if the name itself were water. Quinn tossed his reins to a boy who appeared as if the fire had conjured him. Everybody back from the fall. His gaze swept the yard, counting bodies the way some men count coin, fast, accurate, without apology. Then he looked past Tamiz to the fence line where Barlow Finch hovered in his fine coat, and farther, to the men in banker's gray drawn up behind Lyle Harrow like choir boys who'd been handed guns instead of hymnals. "Harrow," Quinn called, calm as a clean page. "You got legal business in this yard or a death wish?" Harrow lifted his chin. "Seizure under Clause 16 in the event of material loss. Close of business is dawn when fire interrupts ordinary hours. My men are here to secure collateral. Your men jostle one bucket and I'll secure something else," Quinn said mildly. He looked at Tamsin then, really looked, and the set of his voice changed. "You all right?" She nodded. Her throat was raw. Her yes came out as a scrape. He took the answer anyway and turned it into orders. "Keep the line," he told Moss without looking away from Harrow. "Del, get those teams out, pull every wagon beyond the fence. Ortega, wet the ground along the east stack by us a break." Harlan, his eyes moved to Vuss, who lit it. Tamsin swallowed smoke and fury. "Barlow Finch," she said. And the yard went so quiet, The fire seemed for a moment a rude interrupter at its own spectacle. Finch's mouth tilted. That's a grave accusation from a disappointed girl. His glance flicked to the ledger strap across her chest. You've been carrying other men's books like they're babies. Maybe you dropped a lamp. Maybe you got careless. She's many things, Harlan said, stepping up until his shadow cut Finch's boots in half. But careless isn't one. Quinn's gaze sharpened. You actually see him strike? I saw the match. I saw him lean into the corner where someone had poured kerosene. I saw his face when he thought no one was looking. The memory of it hit her again, how neat his profile had looked against the moon. How easy evil is when it believes it wears the right cufflinks. Quinn tipped his hat back a thumb's width. All right. He turned to his youngest deputy. Toby, take 2 men and ride to Finch's place. Bring back any tins, rags, receipts from Harrow's store for kerosene, anything that smells like this yard. Knock. If they don't answer, you're allowed to prefer a kicked door to a burned town. Harrow laughed once, small. You do love your theater, Sheriff, but the law is on paper, not in smoke. My claws, your claws can wait for daylight, Quinn said. While a structure burns, my claws is air and bones. You want to discuss paper? We'll do it when folks aren't dying of your timing. The warehouse groaned again, but the worst of it was down. Flames gnawed and sulked, cut into smaller mouths by men with buckets and curses and stubbornness. The heat eased from murderous to merely mean. Tamsin's hands shook now that the worst demand had lifted, the way hands do when they suddenly have nothing to hold but themselves. Harlan saw it. Sit, he said, not as an order but as an offering, and steered her to the low wall by the pump. He knelt to check her wrist where moss had hauled her through the window. Smoke had smudged her in blacks and grays like a woman sketched in charcoal by a talented child. Don't fuss, she whispered, but she did not pull away. His touch steadied the jitter inside her as surely as a palm on a frightened horse's neck. The deputies returned fast and tight, Toby's nervous horse, lathered and willing. They carried a tin that still dribbled kerosene, a rag that had been torn from a shirt and then stuffed into a pocket with a guilty hand, and a receipt book with a page missing where the ink had bled before it dried. Quinn flicked ash into the dirt and tore through what he'd been handed, like a man who understood that paper can be both sword and shield, depending who holds it. Tobin Finch bought oil at 10 tonight, Toby said. Barlow signed for delivery. I signed for many things, Finch said lightly. A charitable nature is a burden. Your charity smells like a warehouse, Quinn replied. He glanced at Tamsin. You up to making a statement now, Miss Crowell? Tamsin touched the ledger strap. I'll write it. Do both, Quinn said. Speak it so they hear it. Write it so they can't pretend they didn't. She told the story plain. The lamplight she had snuffed, the careful glug-glug of a poured can. The moons cleaned the trail of Finch's silhouette, the match. The narrowness of the window. The particular way smoke crawls up and over and into a throat. She did not dramatize because the night had done that for them. She did not tremble while she spoke because trembling would have been polite. When she finished, Quinn nodded once. Barlow Finch, he said, you're under arrest for arson, conspiracy to defraud, and being an idiot at the wrong volume. Hand your pistol to Deputy Hart, and don't make me regret using words instead of bullets. Barlow glanced right toward Harrow. That glance said more than most men's speeches. Harrow did not move. The space between them became a thing everyone could feel, the exact measurement of a banker's courage. Careful, Sheriff, Harrow murmured. You're arresting a gentleman whose mother sits on the church board and whose father raised a son who thinks poor people burn themselves to make a point, Tamsin said. The smoke had roughened her voice into something that could lift weight. Arrest him. Quinn's men took Finch. The yard breathed all at once, all together, as if someone had told it could. Harrow watched without watching. Voss, he said quietly, calculated for Tamsin to hear. You have hours before default. Your building is ash. You will not make your noon delivery. The clause is the clause. Your lady bookkeeper cannot add time to your columns. She can add witnesses, Harlan said. And she can subtract thieves. I can do something else, Tamsin said, standing. The world swayed and then steadied. I can invite daylight. Daylight? Harrow's smile frayed. What are you? Miss Crowell, a storm? No, she said, and took the ledger from her shoulder as if she were unsheathing a sword that had decided to be made of paper. An accountant with a telegraph. She crossed the yard, found the operator's boy by the gate, and pressed coins into his soot-striped hand. Office, she said. Now, the boy blinked. Ma'am, it's near midnight. And truth doesn't keep bankers' hours, she said, already moving, already feeling the town's eyes follow, the smallness of her body and the bigness of her intent. The telegraph office smelled like oil and patience. The key sat like a beetle under the glass, its leg cocked, ready. Tamsin spread the ledger on the counter and wrote fast and neat in her notebook, the message a braid of numbers and names. Underweights, duplicate tallies, timestamps, deliveries. Received that vanished into overages on Harrow's sheets. She added what Quinn's deputies had found. She added Finch's receipt and the missing page. She added her name. She sent it all to the Territorial Railroad paymaster in Carson City, and for good measure she copied the superintendent and the newspaper in Reno that printed rail schedules and scandals with equal appetite. The wire chattered, urgent as a bird, and then fell still. The boy took up a perch on the stool like a sparrow who'd learned to read. You think they'll answer? He whispered. They already did, Tamsin said, sliding her pencil behind her ear. They just don't know it yet. When she returned to the yard, the fire was down to muttering. The men looked stranger in the softer light, as if the worst version of themselves had gone home and sent their better selves back to finish the work. Quinn had Barlow loaded and ready. Harrow remained by the fence, a man impatient with disaster, because it did not respect his calendar. Sheriff, Tamsin said, once you've put Mr. Finch to bed behind iron, might I ask you for a favor? If it's lawful and doesn't involve me pretending not to know you, Quinn said. I want the church bell at dawn. Harlan turned. The bell? She nodded. If Harrow intends to seize a man's livelihood in daylight, then daylight. We'll hear why. Quinn's mouth pulled to one side. Town meeting? Town reckoning, she said. Bring the foreman from Red Mesa if you can find him. Bring Aurelia's basket if she lend it. I have figures to pour in. Harrow laughed softly, as at a child who demanded a crown and set a butter knife on her head to prove she already wore one. Miss Crowell, you misunderstand. Banks don't ask permission of bells. No, she said. But towns do. And men who want to go on living in them. He did not answer. The line of his back told her everything. He was calculating angles, respectability, the optics of seizing a yard hours after a fire. He was adding her unwelcome to his columns. Dawn came thin and gray, smelling of damp ash and stubborn hope. Quinn kept his promise. The church bell spoke into the morning with the plain authority of old iron. People answered it with coats thrown over nightshirts, and faces creased by sleep and curiosity. Aurelia arrived first of the ladies, pearls straight and mouth tighter. Then a stitch in wet fabric. Tamsin climbed the 3 steps to the church hall platform and set the ledger on the lectern as if it were scripture. She could feel Harrow's eyes on the back of her neck, the way a hawk's shadow touches a rabbit. Harlan stood at the edge of the crowd, hat in hand, sleeves rolled, soot ghosting his cheekbones. He looked both battered and undeniable. Quinn spoke first. A fire at Voss Freight, likely arson. Arrest made. Because the bank intends to enforce a clause at dawn, and I don't enjoy being used as a drum for someone else's march. Miss Crowell has asked to speak. He nodded to Tamsin and stepped back, folding his arms. A man who had decided where his weight belonged. Tamsin let silence gather so it could hear itself. When she spoke, she pitched her voice for the back row and for the people who would pretend later that they hadn't been there. I came to Ashford Crossing with a borrowed dress and a promise from a man who returned it unopened, she said. Some of you watched him do it. Some of you said nothing. Some of you said it quietly to your kitchens. I don't need apologies. I need attention. Look here. She opened the ledger that she did not accuse by name until the numbers had done their work. She drew columns in the air with her hands, and the room followed them as if they were ropes across a ravine. Weight at the yard. Weight at Red Mesa. Averages, variances, dates. Talbot's signature too often on days when the scale had been dirtied. Harrow's interest step conveniently tied to those exact delays. Receipts for kerosene sold in the hours before a fire. Murmur rose, the sound of polite townspeople reorganizing their loyalties in real time. Maybe I'm wrong, Tamsin said. Maybe my columns lie. I invite the foreman to explain his scale. She looked to the side aisle, and there he was, Rex Talbot, dragged in by Quinn's deputies. Like a guilty thought hauled out into speech. Rex tried a smile that had done good service in worse rooms. Scales get dirty, miss. I can't keep a man on his knees with a rag all day. You kept one under table with a knife, she said, and held up the thin wedge of metal they had found beneath Voss's beam. It fits yours too. Laughter. Not kind. Laughter that says a trick has been spotted and will not be purchased again. Banks do good, Harrow said, stepping forward, smooth where Talbot was rough. We hold a town together when cattle prices fall or snow takes the wheat. We are not villains in stories told to gather coins into baskets. Tamsin looked down at Aurelia's donated wicker on the table beside the lectern. No, she said softly, you are not a villain. You are a ledger, and today you are being balanced. The church doors opened to admit a gust of clean cold, and a man with dust at the hem of his fine coat. He carried a leather satchel and the kind of authority that comes printed on paper and signed 3 times. He walked with purpose that did not bend to local weather. Silas Boone, he announced, showing Quinn a packet of documents the sheriff read faster than a man eats when he doesn't trust the cook. Territorial rail. Paymaster and this week. Special auditor because some good woman I've never met blew my key off my table with a wire that wouldn't stop talking. He faced the room. Which of you is Tamsin Kroll? She lifted her hand. Boone bowed the way Eastern men do when they've been humbled by competence. Miss, I'd like to buy you dinner when this is over. Between now and then, may I borrow your courage? He set his satchel on the table and pulled out papers that had been written by men who did not realize how sharp a clause could be until it was held by someone honest. Rex Talbot, he said without looking to see if the foreman rose. You're relieved. The rail does not buy weights. It buys truth. Lyle Harrow, your bank's contracts with the railroad are suspended pending review. Any seizure enacted on the back of fraud will be null and will ensure my pen travels in your direction when I start writing names down the side of an indictment. Harrow's mouth worked and found no word that fit a room that had stopped believing it owed him awe. You can't, I can, Boone said, pleasant as pie. Because the rail owns your reputation more than you think. People don't move to towns where rails do business with thieves. They don't build houses. They don't ride trains. And I like trains. He looked at Tamsin. Miss Kroll, your averages, your letters? They read like music. You up for a walk-through of those scale houses under oath? Yes, she said. The word tasted like something she had bought for herself. Boone nodded. Then I suppose I've found my expert. He turned to Harlan. Mr. Voss, the timber you delivered will be weighed by my men today. You meet noon, we pay before sundown. No seizure, no close of business at dawn nonsense. He paused. And if you require temporary accommodation for this morning's loss, the rail will rent your teams at a decent rate, to haul our own stock to Red Mesa while we replace your roof. It seems to me one hand can wash another without stealing the soap." A sound went through the room that made Tamsin's throat ache, relief, and something a little like pride. Quinn looked sideways at Harrow. "I'd call that daylight," he said. Aurelia lifted her basket as if it might shield her. "This is unseemly," she said. "A town meeting turned due. Accounting." "It's a kind of prayer," Tamsin answered, quiet but not hiding, "asking for the numbers to tell the truth." The meeting dissolved the way rivers do when the ice breaks fast and messy and full of little surprises. Quinn's men led Rex out the back. Barlow Finch would wait for his day in court, in a cell that still smelled faintly of soap and bad decisions. Harrow left without looking at anyone he could not bill. Boone stayed, listening with both ears and 3 pencils while Tamsin walked him through her book, as if it were a map of a country that refuses to be conquered by men who cannot count. When it was done, and the noon whistle at the rail siding blew like a promise, Boone closed his satchel and looked at Harlan and then at Tamsin. "You two aim to keep doing this?" "Doing what?" Harlan asked. "Making an honest town out of a crooked one," Boone said. "Because if you do, the rail would prefer to help instead of hinder." His smile lit up the room's dusty corners. "I don't hire wives, Miss Crowell, and I don't hire men who can't work with women. Keep your arrangement as it is. I'm writing your names into my book as Vos and Crowell. My office will expect figures from both." Harlan's breath left him like a man relearning how not to brace for a blow. He turned to Tamsin, and what sat between them now was not a rescue. Not charity, not even gratitude. It was recognition, clean as spring water. "Partner," he said. She set her hand in his. "Partner." They shook like men do because a woman, who has had her value appraised, publicly understands the economy of ceremony. Afternoon found the yard a workshop of repair. Men hammered temporary braces against the warehouse's scorched ribs while others stacked salvage stock. The mules chewed and looked wise. Ortega whistled tunelessly, but with a determination that made even failure sound useful. Boone's men weighed timber with a severity that made Tamsin smile. The scales sang the same at the yard and at Red Mesa for the first time in a season. She took off her coat and hung it on the pump handle. "We can retarp the north stack if we stagger the canvas," she said to Moss. "Let the wind help instead of turn it into a sail. You hear that?" Moss said to no one and everyone. "That's a woman who knows how to make wind pay rent." Toward sundown, when their bodies remembered they had limits and the light went gold around the edges with contentment, Aurelia appeared at the gate and cleared her throat. She carried her basket. It held gloves. Real ones, stitched neat, bound with ribbon. "I was wrong," Aurelia said without looking up, "about what charity is for. I meant to bury you under it. You dug yourself out. These are for your men." "It's cold." Tamsin took the basket. "Thank you." "Don't make too much of it," Aurelia snapped, then glanced at Boone, who tipped his hat like a man who had decided to admire a woman's spine from a safe distance. "The church board will send soups and items," she swallowed. "For the wives," Tamsin echoed. "And for the hands who aren't married to anything but the work." Aurelia nodded once and left, her pearls crooked for the first time anyone had seen. Night tried to come early, but the yard would not let it. Quinn wandered back with coffee that had learned decency. He leaned on the fence near Harlan and watched Tamsin move through the men as if she'd always been there. "That the girl Finch returned?" he asked softly. "That's the woman," Harlan said, "who returned him to himself in front of the whole town. You in love with her?" Quinn asked it as a man who knows the answer, but understands that saying, it can break a thing, or finally let it breathe. Harlan didn't look away from Tamsin. "I'm in respect with her," he said. "I think the rest has the decency to wait until she decides whether she wants it." Quinn smiled around the rim of his cup. "Good answer." Tell it to me again when spring comes. He sobered. She's safe while I'm sheriff. But Harrow has friends with longer arms than this county. Keep your doors barred and your ledger locked. We have both. They did. But safety is a fugitive when money wants what it thinks it owns. 2 nights later, a man in a black coat with soft hands and an appetite for other people's things came to take the ledger. He slipped into the yard at midnight, made the office window a friend with his knife, and reached for the book where the candle on the desk made a small island of gold. "Stop there," Tamsin said from the darkness. The sound of the pistols, hammer being drawn back, is the same whether a man or a woman pulls it. He froze like soap in a cold pan. "I'm here to make an exchange," the man whispered. "A sack of coin for a sack of numbers." "The only exchange you're making is a sack of air for a cell," she said, and Harlan moved up behind him like a wall with a heartbeat. Quinn's deputies took the man without fuss. On his way past, Tamsin stopped him with a question. "Who sent you?" He hesitated just long enough to tell the truth without using the word. "A man who keeps clean hands," he said. "You won't find dirt under his nails. You'll find it under other people's houses." "Harrow," Harlan said, after they were gone. "Who else?" Tamsin replied. Boone's reply came on paper the next day. The Rail had appointed a conservator over contracts in the county until its own investigation completed. Harrow's power to foreclose on Rail-linked accounts was suspended. Rex Talbot had been dismissed from Red Mesa. An interim foreman one of Boone's men with eyes like calipers would sit on the scale until a new one could be installed, certified by a traveling judge with a fondness for weights and his own. Science of fairness. The yard learned to breathe like a thing without a hand on its throat. Work found a rhythm that felt less like running downhill and more like climbing with purpose. Harlan ran his routes. Tamsin ran the numbers and sometimes the teams when Moss's knee remembered it was old. In the evenings, the stove put its small, honest heat into their bones, and conversation did the rest. One such night, with frost lace on the window and the smell of stew making each man remember a mother, whether he'd had a good one or not, Harlan set 2 cups on the table and did a thing that cost him sweat without moving a muscle. He talked about the piece of land west of the yard. "I kept it for a house," he said. "I thought I'd build one when I had a name to put on the door with mine. I didn't think that name would be on the sign out front first." She looked at him, and the looking felt like stepping onto a new bridge and feeling it hold. "You're offering me a door," she said. "I'm offering you a choice," he answered. "This town put you on a platform and measured you like flour. I won't do that. If you want a door, I'll build it. If you want a desk and the rest of your nights, I'll guard them. If you want me, I'll try to be a man that adds to your columns instead of becoming one." The silence that followed was not awkward. It was sacred, like rooms in a house you don't enter until the boards have learned your name. "I want to earn the day," she said, "and then we'll see what the night brings." He nodded like a man who had decided patience belonged to bravery. "Then we'll be brave." Spring came as if it had been waiting in the rafters of the rebuilt warehouse. Blossoms opened on the cottonwoods along the creek like small flags declaring neutrality in every war. The Rail paid as promised. Voss and Crowell printed itself on the side of the office door in letters that looked like they had been there, waiting under the paint all along. Men came from 2 towns over to ask if Tamsin would look at their books the way a doctor listens to. A Hart. Barlow Finch went to trial in June. He sat small in the defendant's chair with his mother's jaw set for him. But jaws cannot stop juries. He was sentenced to a term that would give him years to think about scales and matches, and what a poor woman will do when you try to set her life on fire. Harrow was not in the room to see it. He had suddenly discovered urgent business. In Santa Fe, where the air is thinner and the laws can still be made to trip over themselves if you are quick with a pen, Boone kept his name in print until even the nicer hotels lost track of his luggage. on a Sunday, with heat laid down flat. Over the town like a sleeping animal, Tamsin stood on the ridge above the yard and imagined the house Harlan had mentioned. Not what it would look like on a postcard. What it would feel like when you stepped out of it into a day you wanted. You wouldn't want to leave the door unlatched. Harlan said from behind her, as if he had been walking with the thought and it had turned and smiled at him. "No." She said, "But I might want the windows open." He came to stand beside her. "I could learn to like that." Down in the yard, Ortega missed a note and laughed. The laugh floated. The world did not break. Tamsin's hand found Harlan's without either of them calling the moment something in a hurry. "Do you know," she said, "people still use that phrase like it's a verdict? Too poor. They say it when they mean something else. What do they mean? They mean unmoneyed, unmannered, unwelcome to the table." She looked at her hands, the ink ghosts, the callus from the ledger strap, the small pale scars that belonged to irons and a cracked boiler, and a foundry that had closed before it learned her name. "I don't think I'm poor. I think I had. My worth mispriced by men who don't know how to read columns that carry women's names at the top." Harlan breathed out. It sounded like agreement and apology and a future in one exhale. "Then we'll print new tables," he said. "They built the house in pieces because that is how honest things grow. First the foundation that put its palms into the earth and tested the handshake. Then walls, but not so many there'd be no space for light to argue its way in. A roof that decided rain could be invited without being allowed to stay. A door, yes, with 2 names on it. She did not hurry the paint. She had learned the hard way that finish before structure is how things fall down. On the day they nailed the sign Vos and Crowell Freight and Provisions, Silas. Boone rode up with dust on his boots and an envelope fat with good trouble. "Miss Crowell," he said, "the rail would like to certify you as an independent auditor for this stretch. You keep us honest, we keep you paid." He grinned. "Also, my sister in Carson City has demand for 100 ledgers bound the way you bind them, waxed thread, linen tape, spines that don't lie when a man leans on them. If you ever wanted a side business that smells like paper and glue instead of mules, you write me." Tamsin laughed and tried to imagine a room full of books that had never been read by a liar. "One business at a time," she said. "But thank you for seeing." Boone sobered. "I didn't see. You made me look." He tipped his hat to Harlan and wheeled away with a competence that almost made him forgiven for everything men in fine coats get wrong. Summer thunderheads built themselves into castles and then forgot how to be so tall and fell down rain on everyone equally. The creek filled, then lowered, then remembered its banks. The town learned habits that felt less like apology and more like practice. Aurelia's basket became a thing the church kept for actual need, not for pointing. Quinn's laugh grew easier, which is what happens to lawmen when they spend fewer nights siding with paper over people. On a late August evening, with heat laying quiet behind the day and the mules sighing in their sleep, Tamsin sat on the stoop of the new house and watched the last light drag its feet across the yard. Harlan came out and sat beside her. He set a cup of coffee on the step between them like a treaty signed by 2 honest generals. "You know," he said, "you were not saved." She considered that. "No," she said. "I was seen? By Boone?" He asked, teasing, "By you?" She said simply. The quiet that followed felt like a room they'd built between them, one that could hold contradiction and still be called home. He reached for her hand and did not rush. She let him take it because she decided it'd be on her terms or not at all. "Marry me," he said, as a question so carefully wrapped she could set it on the table and turn it over 10 times. Without it breaking, she smiled into the dusk. "Ask me again after first frost." He laughed like a man who'd been given a long job and a strong back. "All right, I have time." "You have patience," she corrected, and squeezed his fingers once before letting go. They watched the yard together, then the stacks, the rebuilt roof, the pump, the scuffed place where the bucket line had planted its feet and refused to retreat. Tamsin thought of the girl who had stepped off the train and been measured in public by people who believed a woman's price should be printed in coin. She thought of the woman who had stepped onto a church platform and read numbers to a town that had remembered how to listen. She thought of the house behind her with 2 names on the door and a third name her own no longer arguing with itself. Trouble would ride in again. It always did. Legends fade slower than scars, and Ashford Crossing had both. But trouble would find a yard that had learned to hold a line and a woman who knew how to weigh a lie against the truth and price it accordingly. When the first frost came and painted the pump handle white, Harlan asked again, and she said yes, in a tone that made the word sound like a ledger closing clean. She married him without giving him her work because she had no intention of divorcing herself from the part of her that had saved her. The town gathered under the rebuilt eaves with pies that steamed their breath into the cold, and an orchestra of 3 men who could not agree on key but agreed on joy. Aurelia cried neatly and handed Tamsin gloves she had stitched herself. Quinn danced like a lawman who had set down his badge for an evening without putting it out of reach. Boone arrived late with a bottle under his coat and a story about a Fanwa banker in Santa Fe who had discovered that trains do not slow down for men who insist they should. After they had gone, and the lanterns made a canopy out of the dark, Harlan and Tamsin stood in the doorway of the house with 2 names. He slid his palm over the painted letters the way men do when they can't quite believe a thing will stay true if they stop touching it. This all started with 'too poor,' he said. She nodded. And became just right. She leaned into him then. Not like someone rescued, but like someone who had picked her rescue up herself and carried it over the last mile with a stubbornness that had learned how to be gentle with the good things it found below them. The yard breathed. The rebuilt warehouse creaked like an old friend settling into a chair. The mules snored. The ledger on the desk sat fat with months of numbers that had learned to tell the truth because a woman made them. And the town that had watched her be returned at a depot had taught itself how to return favors instead, to throw bells wide for reckonings, to choose daylight, to step back when a woman needed room to swing her courage. Tomorrow, men would wake and weigh and lift and laugh. Trouble would remember the road in, so would justice. And in the middle of it a woman named Tamsin Kroll would keep choosing, day after day, to price herself at cost, breath for breath, kindness for kindness, labor for honest pay, love on her own terms. That is the arithmetic that saved Ashford Crossing. That is the ledger you cannot seize. 2 more great stories are next. Don't miss them. Subscribe and turn on notifications.